Okay, good evening, everyone. I call this meeting of the Urban Design Commission to order. The time is now 7:05 p.m. on Tuesday, June 16th, 2020. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, GLC 30A, Section 18, and the Governor's March 15th, 2020 order imposing strict limitations on the number of people that may gather in one place, as well as Mayor Kurt DeTone's declaration of emergency dated March 15th, 2020, this meeting of the Urban Design Commission will be conducted via remote participation. We will post an audio recording, audio-video recording, transcript, or other comprehensive record of these proceedings as soon as possible after the meeting on the City of Somerville website. Members of the Urban Design Commission that are present, I believe Luisa Oliveira has joined us, myself, Sarah Lewis, our co-chairs. Frank Valdez is with us this evening, as is Deborah and Andrew Arbach. Joining us are senior planners Dan Bartman and Rebecca Cooper from Planning and Zoning. Continuation of the Edge Assembly project. Before we get started, I would like to sort of remind us, sort of what our purview is and what we have to do this evening. So we've voted on the massing and the elevations, but we still have to review the rest of the schematic design options and understand sort of which, if we're going to identify priority guidelines, which of those are priorities. Make sure that all those guidelines have been achieved to the satisfaction of them. And if they haven't, make sure that we can make recommendations to the applicant for potential improvements. So the guidelines are broken into different categories. So I'm going to go through those briefly. So the general categories for you to think about are the architectural bays, towers, specifically the ground story, connection to abutting open spaces, and the materials. And we'll go back to these guidelines at the end when we're ready to vote. So I am going to turn it over to Victor. Are you presenting? I'll present to the team. If only those who are speaking or the committee could have their cameras on, I think that will be helpful. And please remember, let's try to limit the presentation to 20 minutes.
Okay. And Sarah, could you just speak real quick to because we are splitting, we're going to talk about landscape tonight, but we're not talking about the civic space component tonight, correct? I just want to make sure everyone understands the scope of the site work that we're going to be addressing this evening.
Yes, the only application before us right now is the what I'm going to call the building lot. So within the actual property line proper. So It's that area of landscaping.
Okay.
The civic space will come under a separate application later.
Yes, Ryan, your team is all joined under your single invite, so I don't know which Ryan, and you're not Ryan in the first place, but I don't know which Ryan to give the controls to.
I don't either, and I don't have any way of changing my name as far as I can tell.
that found you talking
okay.
from it.
Yeah, it's this one here. I'm going to share the presentation. Caroline's actually going to start off talking about the site work, and then I will get into addressing some of the building components that we discussed last time.
Okay, thank you, Victor.
Thanks, Victor. Yeah, we're all for one and one for all. So we all have the same name today.
Exactly. Can people see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So with that, let's just jump right in because I know we're short on time. Caroline, you want to take it away?
As Victor just mentioned, well, first of all, hi everyone. I'm happy to be here today and to have the chance to talk about the landscape. I know there were some questions in the previous meeting that we didn't get to, so we'll jump right in. As Victor mentioned, the project is a little bit complex in terms of public realm and open space because there are various parcels that we're looking at. In this diagram, you can see in the darkest of the green colors, that's the immediate lot area that we're looking at tonight. Just south of that, there's also the Kensington Avenue right-of-way, which we're looking at as the transformation of that space as part of how we're going to be meeting the civic space requirements, which will be part of that subsequent meeting. And we're also looking at improvements to an existing City of Somerville parcel to the south, which we're calling the off-site open space improvements. And we won't talk about that tonight either, but it's important to note that as we're designing even the immediate building lot, we're thinking about it sort of as one place. So we're really trying to integrate the design of all of these various parcels into one unified and integrated public realm. Important to note that within the immediate building lot, we are providing 27% open space. So we're well complying there. If you go to the next slide. You can see colored in the sort of lime color, that's the civic space, which is primarily that Kensington Avenue right-of-way with a small area that actually falls within the property as well. You can see that's part of an entry plaza. And the civic space is 25% of the open space. And that's being met in that green area. If you go to the next slide. In the previous meeting, there was a question about the relationship of the building to some of the surrounding features, including the highway, so we added in this section to explain sort of the scale and the relationship here. You can see that we have some complex neighbors just to the west of the project with 93, and then you have Mystic Ave, which is at grade, partly below the highway, and then there's an off-ramp from 93 that comes quite close to our parcel, but immediately adjacent to our parcel is Marginal Road, and that's the road that actually connects to an abutter to the south that we'll look at in a moment. You can see the property line, the landscape immediately around the building within the property line is primarily streetscape on the east and the west. And we are coordinating the design of the streetscape with the City of Somerville's plans for Middlesex Ave in terms of transformation of that street. Today there's head-end parking along Middlesex Ave along our property, and it looks like that will be changing. So here's our site plan, and you can see in red that immediate property area, as well as the other designations, the civic space outlined in the blue and the off-site improvements to the south. And we'll zoom in a moment into the immediate area, but it's important to note that one of our major goals for the project is to make the site feel like a garden. We know with the highway next door, it may not be a place where people will be hanging out all day, given the noise, but we do want to make it a welcoming, inviting, and comfortable space for people as they move from neighborhood to neighborhood, because this is a little bit of a gateway site, or people who come out from the building or from the surrounding area who might want to take a break, read a book, have some lunch or something like that. In terms of vehicular circulation, you can see the different routes called out in pink in this diagram. The little things that look like pills are parallel parking. The primary access for vehicles into our building is from the north, from McGrath Highway. There's a service and loading bay, as well as a garage entrance to the surface garage under the building off of that face. We're really trying to keep those uses away from the main civic space to really prioritize pedestrians in those open spaces. And you can see that the driveway continues along Marginal Road west of the building and serves the existing parking for the public storage abutter just to the south of our site. So we're maintaining that connection for them since they need that access. We are looking at the transformation of Kensington to become that civic space, but we'll maintain fire lane per city recommendations through that space. So we have to provide 20-foot drivable route through the site, but we really want it to look pedestrian. So we're treating it more as a plaza space. In terms of bikes, the site is also at an interesting nexus. It does serve as a gateway between neighborhoods to the west and the Assembly Square district, and that includes this connector that's come up in some of the previous conversations. Our project starts just to the north of sort of the connector, but we are anticipating receiving that movement into our site. So you can see that we're anticipating sort of a shared use path coming through the site from the connector just north of the existing public storage building and their existing plaza. And then that route connects to the crosswalk that comes across and goes into Foley Street, which leads you to the Assembly T and other sort of Assembly Square destinations to the east. We also have bike lanes within Middlesex Ave, and we're looking at 2 different bike parking spaces. There's a blue bike station proposed along Middlesex Ave with 19 blue bikes, and there's also short-term bike parking closer to the building entrance that is quite visible as well from that connector. In terms of pedestrian connectivity, we're making sure that the project is contributing to a walkable environment and sort of knitting together the site to the surrounding streetscape as much as possible. So we've got, proper streetscape with street trees and comfortable walking paths buffered by those street trees on the with the walking path on the interior per the zoning guidelines, where you see the pink lines as well as sort of desire lines that are being accommodated through the open space south of the project. So we know that there's sort of that through movement that connects to Foley Street and Assembly Square to the east, but there also are the desire lines that bring you to the building entry. Along Middlesex Ave, where we have a more generous setback from the building, there's a sort of a wedge-shaped streetscape there, and that provides an opportunity for some really nice streetscape where we can have spaces that can be dedicated to some of the retail within the building, where you can have, whether it's indoor, outdoor dining, or other special spaces relating to those programs. This is an example that sort of gets at the spirit of what we're after. And you can see that a little bit on those sort of niches carved into the streetscape along the Middlesex frontage. On the north side, the streetscape is a little bit simpler, and we'll look at sections on the next side with breaks just to allow access to the service and garage entrances, and a simpler streetscape on the west buffering Marginal Road. The city zoning has certain requirements that vary depending on the type of frontage. Along Marginal Road, which is the western edge of the site, where we do not have parallel parking, we have a 6-foot streetscape planting with street trees, and then we have a 6-foot walking zone, which is the minimum requirement. Along McGrath, the north face of our site, we have a 9-foot walking route, a 6-foot streetscape, and then a 2-foot sort of step out of your car edge zone. And then
can I point something out for a second, just to make sure that the commission understands? These are actually on city property. These are within the right-of-way line and outside the property line. So all of these sections will be refined with engineering, mobility, and PSOP.
That's right. And this is a view facing south within that Middlesex frontage of sort of a sketch of the plan overlaid, where you can see those zones along the facade of the building with the walking zone, and then some of those gathering spaces and retail spaces sort of nested into the streetscape. We're also meeting some of the city's requirements for trees, which really make sure that projects provide adequate soil volume to get healthy and long-lived street trees. Each street tree needs to be spaced between, I believe, 35 and 45 feet, and we're at 35 for the most part, or within that. And then we have the required either 1,000 cubic feet of soil per tree. In some cases, you're allowed to share 25% of that volume between adjacent trees. So trying to set ourselves up for healthy street trees. This view looks back at the building from Foley Street, the Foley Street intersection. So if you're sort of approaching the project, walking from Assembly Square towards the building, this would be your approach and crosswalk. Go to the next slide. This is the view from that connector space looking into the open space. You can see the building on the left, and you can see the sort of open area, and the center left is where the through block plaza civic space is, with that wider opening, which sort of brings you towards the building. And then on the right-hand side, the connection towards Foley Street, that sort of through route that takes you towards Assembly Square. And this view is a little bit of the drive-by from the off-ramp of 93, where you look down and you catch a glimpse of the sort of garden-like quality of the open space, which we hope will contribute sort of a positive image to the sort of gateway or arrival experience into this district.
Okay, so that was our quick summary of the site context. Sarah, do you want me to jump in and tackle the 4 architectural issues that we said we'd come back and talk to, or do you want to talk about site first?
Unless the board has does the commission have any questions at the moment? Or should we just keep moving forward? All right, keep moving.
Okay, I will try to do this quickly. You all know the guidelines are here for just for reference. The first issue that we said we'd come back with, though, is talk about a little bit more detail around the winter gardens and the balconies on the tower. And as you recall, on the different sides, we've got these vertical openings, these slots that are looking into the building. This is really where these balconies and these terraces are occurring as they go up. And I think the question last time was to understand a little bit more around detail, around materiality, how we really saw these as being expressed. So there's a couple key things to understand. At the bottom of these, where we've got the larger outdoor terraces, these still have to be developed in detail, but we do see these as a mix of essentially decked area and softscape planting, the exact design to be determined, but you can see some precedent images on the right. The slots and the balconies themselves we see as being lined in I'm going to call it a wood-like material, probably not real wood in the end because we do want them to be maintainable, but the goal is to achieve warmth and texture and a human scale. The balconies themselves we see as being relatively minimal. It's not to have a big solid wall upturn. We really want a transparent glass handrail, a lighter feel to the balcony, and the goal is to have this be transparent to the inside. If I get a little bit closer here, you start to get the sense, the idea of that glass railing. We've actually eliminated any spandrel glass in these areas because we really want to maximize that transparency to within. And the intent ultimately is to start to have these planted, but this is going to have to be something that we work with the tenants on because ultimately they will control the interior of the space. If we look dimensionally at these spaces, as I said, the balconies themselves are not giant, right? You can see the plan diagram up in the top right, roughly 5 feet deep, maybe 17 foot wide in this particular case. This is a good indicator of size. These are not meant to be giant gathering spaces. These are smaller, quiet respites on the floor plan. And like I said, no spandrel glass here. The intent is really to have any fascia held back from the glass, ultimately with the goal of allowing tenants to have the opportunity to create double height spaces here, which you see at the bottom of the section, if they so choose. That's how we're going to design it. That's how we're going to structure it so that they can choose to do that if they want to, but we're also not going to push it on them. So that's the goal of the balconies, these terraces, and the winter gardens. The second issue was the top of the building, essentially a penthouse. And we talked a little bit last time about the base, the middle, and the top. And I think the conversation was that while there was some expression going on at the top of a differentiation, it wasn't really showcasing itself as much as maybe as it could, while still trying not to put a hat on the building. So we've come back with 3 different approaches here. Option A on the left is essentially what we showed last time. And this is going to be a mechanical penthouse, so these are largely going to be louvers. The intent of the one on the left was that this was originally meant to be a pretty small scale, finely grained louver that started to pick up on the same texture of the windows below. But you do get to express this sawtooth at the top of the building as it reaches to the sky, which we thought was a nice thing, but maybe not really differentiated enough. Option B in the middle goes to a much more heavily textured louver, so that you really start to play with the expression of this at the top of the building. It is still the same verticality, still picking up on the same structural bays, but also still allowing for that articulation of the sawtoothing at the top of the building, which we think is a nice addition to the skyline, particularly as you look up at the building. It gives a real life and a real texture. The third option on the right is saying, well, we've got this this frame language around all the windows and all those floors, which essentially creates this horizontal fin. Maybe within that louver system, we could pick up on another level of that fin detailing and begin to express that as it goes all the way up, and even close it off as it gets to the top of the building. Again, to pick up on some of the existing architecture, but to create a little bit of a difference at the top. Also, I think fairly successful, though personally I miss the kind of crenellated skyline at the top, and I think that the design team is sort of leaning towards option B here as a way of expressing the top of the building, but still maintaining some of that detail. Third issue was around the facades at the building base. We showed you these last time. These are the same elevations from last time, the base elevations going around the building. We've included these just added in a large scale, not to talk about, but sort of as part of the record around all 4 facades. But I do want to jump in and talk about the details at the base. And the goal here is to make sure that we are really responding to the guidelines. I won't go through the details of those, with a particular emphasis on the south lobby facade and then the retail facades moving along Middlesex Ave and the end of the McGrath Highway edge there. So I want to start on the lobby facade, and there's a number of options here because I think there are some interesting challenges. This first one is essentially what we showed you last time. And as I mentioned before, the goal here was to really have a very, very transparent lobby facade, because consistent with the open space that Caroline just talked about, the goal here is to have something very transparent and to welcome that landscape in the building and the life of the building out into that landscape. It was not to create a barrier here. So this is essentially an all glass facade. The structural columns are falling behind that glass wall. And here we essentially just had a series of revolving doors in that facade. Now, I think what we've heard subsequently is that while the design intent here might be right, it's not technically complying with the design guidelines. So we've gone and explored a couple other things for consideration. The second option, which is just really a variation of the first one, is to pull those columns outboard of the glass, basically to switch up the column line and the glass line to give a little bit more presence on that outside face. It doesn't look a whole lot different here because we're not framing those doors, but we are bringing the verticality outside and really kind of emphasizing what I would call these larger vertical portals into the building. Option 3 was to take essentially something very similar to that, but now to embed the columns in the glass line and begin to create a horizontal expression to create, I think, more of this conventional portal approach, which you see here. I'm just going to go on the record. I don't think this is particularly successful from an aesthetic purpose, and kind of starts to defeat the intent of the connection between the park and the open space and the lobby space. The fourth option, and we're just kind of showing you our stream of conscious here, was to really create a true framed portal. We're still going to have the columns behind the glass line, but to create an actual entry point that is very, very clear. Again, I'm not sure this is entirely successful. It feels a little added to the building in fighting the transparency of the lobby. And so the last option that we want to talk about is a little bit of a different approach where we actually move the front doors. And if the goal is to have sort of an identified entry frame and entry portal, to actually take the vertical language of those slots that go up through the building and move the entry doors to the base of that slot, which is now facing directly to Middlesex Ave, basically eliminating the doors from the south lobby facade altogether, just letting that be the transparent glass plane to maximize the connection indoors and out and allow the entry to be framed in that east facing portal. So that's a lot to dump on you, but you can keep those in your mind for consideration and discussion. The next part of this then is to talk about the street front along Middlesex. I'm going to go around all 4 facades very quickly here. And this is just a little bit more detail based on what we had last time. The intent wasn't to change it radically, but to bring down another level of texture into this facade. So if the south-facing facade is really about transparency, here along Middlesex Ave, we want to bring a little bit more detail, a little bit more texture, and a little bit more scale. And really just 2 subtle options here. The goal is always to bring this relief of these vertical fins of these mullions that are working off of the scale and the proportion of the frames up above on the main facade, while still being broken by the entry canopy that is slicing all the way through the building, and then allowing for this heavier signage band to create those framed openings, those more solid openings within the structural grid of the building. And in this case, as you can see in the plan detail on the bottom right, the columns are really set inboard, and it's really just how we express the solid panel on the outside. The sub option here is to pull those columns outboard and really give the facade a little bit more depth and to express the verticality of that frame just a little bit more, but the intent is more or less the same. As we walk around the north facade, what you see in the left third of this elevation is still the retail frontage, and the right 2/3 is really where the service and parking access, which is what those larger dark gray rectangles. We've got sort of 2 options that we are playing with right now. Again, you can see where it's labeled vision glass. That's meant to be storefront. Everything else is sort of opaque. In this option, we say, fine, we're going to take the panelization and even the material that we're going to change it to spandrel glass and allow that to extend across the service facade so that we've got a continuity of this system. We, again, like I said in our last meeting, we don't want there to be a back door to this building. There is no back. We need this to be just as attractive and as appealing as all the other facades. So this is about pulling the retail facade type essentially across this face. Whereas our other option is, and I'll show you the next facade in a minute, is really more about pulling the base building facade, the tower facade articulation across where these service points to the building are. So we are differentiating between the retail facade component and the service facade component with a different material type. And then on that west facade, the facade that is facing the highway, because this is essentially all back of house space. We have mechanical equipment back there, looking at a facade where we are bringing the verticality down, infilling with a series of louvers or a mix of louvers and some spandrel glass to bring in just a little bit more detail, but adding a little bit of a detail at the base of solid material as the building is coming down and touching the ground. And then the last topic to fly through here, the 4th one, was questions around the material palette. And this is relatively straightforward for us, I think. There's a lot of work to be done here. But you remember we kind of had 3 different scenarios. The infill, the basic grid of the facade, the inserts, the facade type B, where those wood frames were sliding out, and then what was happening at the base of the building. The bulk of the facade, that facade type A, we are really truly looking at a photovoltaic system. That is what is going to make up the majority of the solid surface. Everything else is essentially glass or spandrel glass with a little bit of additional metal frame to infill between in the horizontals between those PV units. And the goal is to make those really match. We're not looking to have the metal look radically different from the PV. PV today comes in a wide range of technologies and colors and textures. We are still looking at the details of the system because this is about making this building perform. What I do believe that we know at this point is that we are going to be looking at a relatively dark PV system. That's where we are going to get our highest performance, our highest energy conversion efficiency. So it's going to be somewhere in the range of a dark blue to a dark gray to an almost black. We're not going to be doing a really light silver. We're not going to be doing green or orange, which you can get now, but that these are going to be relatively dark in color. And there are, as I said, a different series of different technologies where you see the grid more, you see the grid less. These are going to have to come as we get through schematic design, design development, and even into CDs to make sure that we understand what the details, the performance, and the costs of all of these are. But these represent the range of what we're looking at. Those vertical slots, like I said, are really meant to be articulated as wood or a wood-like material. I don't know exactly what that material is yet, but we are looking at something that does have texture, that does have a real warmth to it, and that looks and feels like wood when a person comes up to it, because these are spaces that a person is going to be able to directly interact with and come in contact with. So we want to make sure that these are rich, that these are warm, that these are welcoming, that these signify life. And actually, we think it's something that's going to go really nicely with that darker tone of the photovoltaic facade. And then lastly, the base of the building, obviously the glass is going to be the glass around the base. We really do want to strive for maximum transparency, minimal reflectivity, minimal tint. But we imagine that the rest of the infill mullion system is going to be something of a darker gray, something that starts to pick up on what we're doing with the PV facade up above. So that becomes the rest of the infill. And I think with that, that's the 4 topics that we addressed last time. I'm sorry that was a lot and so quick. We are happy to go back and talk in detail about any of these.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Victor. Apparently our webcam limit has been reached, so you're not going to see me. You're going to get a discombobulated voice unless one of our Ryan Sullivans is willing to not be on camera any longer. At this point in time, we need to, thank you, Carolyn. At this point in time, it's up to the commission. If you have any comments or questions or observations.
Do you want to do it by topic, or how do we want to start with the?
Well, I was going to see if anybody had any general overview comments first, and then we can go through the guidelines if that makes sense.
I had a question. I think Caroline in her presentation had referenced sort of a city plan for Middlesex Avenue. Is that available, and is that at what level and what point is that at?
That is still in schematic. I am working with mobility and engineering to get that finalized. So where the curb line is probably where the team is showing the curb line. That is probably where it's going to be based on the schematics cross sections we have now. But what the, sort of the final design of that streetscape area is, we're not sure. We're not sure yet, as far as I haven't had discussions with mobility about the location of the site being on private property.
So I have my other question was, so Assembly Row, Assembly as a district has a fairly regularized streetscape standard at this point, and this does not follow it, which is, not that bad or good. Is the intent that Middlesex would become part of that larger system, or is the fact that this varies okay?
At this point in time, I actually don't know the answer to that. It would be our intent that there is definitely some tie-in to it, but not necessarily a full replication.
Sarah, can I suggest that we just take a step back and explain this process a little bit? So this is at a much higher level, and it's expected that the developers are going to be working with the Public Space and Urban Forestry Department to really refine these designs. There's a number of things about the street trees that you can't tell from this scale. So I don't know, Dan, also if you wanted, or maybe you did this before I hopped on, and I apologize for not being able to get on, talk about, you know, what this process is and how this informs what's coming in the future with this. I think that would be helpful in terms of some of these larger questions.
Well, generally speaking, design review was realigned from when it used to take place in time from previously to early in the process, so that the commission can provide recommendations and steer the design team towards a solution, not critique a final design concept. So it is a different format than we had previously managed in the city, but the whole intent is to provide them guidance from their peers in reaching a final design solution that would then be presented through a formal development review application. But you are seeing things at very early in the process.
So for example, Andrew's comment of, does the street meet the other, is it the same as the other streets, or will it work, is appropriate at this time. But my comment about what is the soil volume underneath the trees is to be determined. We will do a more comprehensive review, is my point.
Yes.
So I have a question in regard to the functionality of this part of Assembly Square, you know, which I think of as the back of Assembly Square. And I'm wondering if it's, you know, what its character is now, and whether it's going to change at all in the future. In other words, what's across the street from this building?
Currently, it is the back of the former Kmart and Trader Joe's. However, that is all intended to change as part of the neighborhood plan. It has always been intended that what is called the marketplace, basically the strip mall, will be broken up into city blocks, just like sort of the extension of the streets of the Assembly Row would come down to Middlesex. And so essentially it would be Middlesex Avenue will be another main street. And so that'll be an A street, for example, whereas a B street might occur on what is now the front driveway of the shops in the marketplace. So it does keep that rhythm going across the larger site.
Great, thank you very much.
And I guess sort of one more sort of dumb question too. So is Marginal Road only providing access to those parking spaces at the public storage building? That's the whole point of that road?
It's the parking spaces and a fire lane. So, but it's essentially, yes, it's just the access to the rear of that building.
Gotcha.
Okay. It functions as an alley. So at some point, I would imagine it's no longer going to be named Marginal Road. It actually has, strangely enough, at least 3 different names, as best as we can tell, on different maps. So I'm sure the fire department would love clarification on that one too.
Is it required to be that width? It seems like an awful lot of paving to accomplish very little.
That's a very good question. I will follow up on that to see if there is perhaps a way that we can, reclaim some of that pavement.
Sarah, just to clarify on that would be completely separate from our project though, correct? That would just be an individual city project?
Yes, correct, because it is city right of way.
Thank you.
Okay, I am going to suggest that we read through the design guidelines and go through each one, if that's okay with you, just to make sure that we have what we need for the report. Unless the commission has a preferred, a different way of doing it.
Is it possible to go through the options that Victor presented and us vote on like which ones we think are more viable than the other ones first?
Most definitely.
Okay.
Dan, have you got your PowerPoint handy?
Yep. So I only have like example graphics. I don't have as many sheets. So if there's one that you would like to see, we can switch back to the other presentation.
Okay, that's fine. So,
and I have this in design guideline first, and then the options, so we can take them out of order if necessary.
that's fine. I mean, I think that we can go through the options presented, and we can talk about the one that is preferred or the one that we like the most, and see how that works. And since we're talking about building top, I would say that the evolution from option A to option B is actually a better proposition. I think that it emphasizes a little bit more of what the top can be. I know that it's a mechanical component, and I would say that option B definitely offers a better compromise and asserts what the zoning design guidelines required. So I would vote for facade option B. Understand that as he moves further, obviously we would like to see some of these materials, right, moving forward. But it's my vote to say option B works. I don't like option C.
Frank, I agree. Option B is the strongest. And I'm curious whether the louvers, which way they're inflected, would you see the sky, or would would they be inflected the other way?
I don't think we know that. No, it's a good question, Deborah. I don't know the answer to that yet. I think we have to dig in and look at that a little bit more. It is an interesting question. I guess I had always imagined that the top was a little bit more opaque, so that the vertical panels going up don't feel flimsy. I don't think you want it to feel like a screen. I think you want it to feel more opaque than that. So I suspect that maybe you're not going to see the sky through them, but it's certainly something that we need to look at in more detail.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that assessment.
And to get more information later as we move forward on materiality, I think would be helpful. But I would say that building top option B is good.
So do I have a motion?
I call for a motion, option B.
Second.
Deborah seconds. All right, roll call vote. Frank?
Yes, option B.
Deborah?
Yes.
Okay, Andrew?
B.
Okay.
So Sarah, you actually don't need to call on Frank and Deborah because he moved it and she seconded it. So only Andrew votes.
They could change their mind.
They could change their mind, you're right.
I have all the power.
Okay,
All right, terrific. Thank you.
next option.
All right, so this is the ground story. The one thing that I
Right.
would like to make a comment on first is the way the zoning ordinance, and it's the standards, not the guidelines, talks about storefronts and lobby entrances as being framed, sort of frames that are different than the fenestration per se. So that doesn't talk about materials. So for example, I do want to caution that option A, as Victor had pointed out, doesn't actually meet the zoning as it is written. If there, sort of if it had more of a thicker frame, perhaps, around similar to C, but maybe not as heavy, that would be different. So I just want to caution you on those,
Sure.
the storefront
Sure.
interpretation.
I would say, Victor, I really was intrigued by your option E, in which you actually moved everything away from creating that entry from that. So you clear that space by being just like glass, and like you remove all the junk that you presented from B, C, and D, and you leave it open, which I think is great, and that you shift the entry into E, which faces the road in front better, and it creates just a better portal. And I think that it complies a lot more consistent with what the guidelines are saying. So I would say that, I mean, if you wanted to bring up the rendering of E, I would say that E would be a preferred option from my perspective as what I would support. I think that it's doing everything.
I think it's the one that complies the most clearly and in a way that doesn't feel forced and fighting the rest of the intent. So yes.
Yeah, it's not fighting it. And it leaves the glass in front of the park just as glass.
Yep.
And I think that it creates that connection clearer. And I think it's great, as opposed to trying to force the entries into that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like the way it amplifies the entrance, and you slip into the building as opposed to this frontal. I think it's probably, I think the garden behind would be more interesting too, to not have the patterns of circulation directly into them. So I agree with that also.
Right.
I mean, it also helps you notice. It also helps you notice what's happening above, which I like.
Sure. Yep.
Also, not only does it amplify the door.
I would just say, Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm speaking out of turn. I think the design team would agree and would support that approach.
Yeah, I think it's for all the qualities that everyone just spoke of. As we think that's a great approach. Yeah.
So the design seems happy with it. If the commission's happy, if it feels like that's the way to go, then.
And I would assume that the same materiality that you're bringing down to that area, which is the wood-like, not wood component, remains to be seen, would be similar to what you're proposing in the balconies as well.
Correct. Yes.
So you're like bringing some of that. So I think that's very successful.
That comes all the way down.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay. I will for E.
All right, do I hear a motion?
A motion for E.
Okay.
A second for E.
Okay. And Deborah?
And I agree.
Okay, unanimous it is. Option E. Okay, Middlesex Avenue ground story. This again, sort of as you can see, sort of the framing here as to what the storefront is clear on both of these schemes. So it's up to deliberations.
Is A what was proposed previously and B just a reinterpretation for the?
Yes, essentially yes. I think maybe we tweaked some things to add a little bit more detail. We had talked last time, about the curb and all of that. So these are very much variations on a theme. if I may, and this is obviously up to you guys, because they are variations on the theme, to me, I guess the question would be more is, are they both essentially compliant with the intent of the guidelines and the regulations, and therefore we can continue to basically develop them to figure out what is best, because the columns are in the same place. The goal is to have some depth in this facade, some texture. The goal is to frame the entries, but I personally don't know that these are so different that it requires a picking one or the other. I mean, I'm happy to if you guys want to, but I would propose, I'd put that out there as well as an option. We just need to, I think, understand if we are meeting the requirements.
Well, either one, I think. I like them being distinct from the face, the south face, and the distinct, and that the south face has a stronger relationship with outside, and here it's more about different things behind that wall as opposed to an extension of green space. So I sort of like the deeper one better, but I feel like it's something that needs development with the whole building.
And when you say deeper, Deborah, are you saying B or A?
I think, if I'm reading it correctly, I think B.
B, yep.
B is deeper.
Wait, I should probably look at it. I've got the slideshow here and look at it from the front.
I don't know.
I'm not sure. Yeah, looking at it 3D. Yeah.
I mean, I think that within the compliance perspective, I think that there is a compliance with it. I do like the idea of B as of like something heavy that's coming down and establishing, bringing the columns and establishing something heavy at the bottom that is holding this thing. And I think that there's something to be said about that. That would be the only thing that I think differentiates the two, right, Victor? Yep. And the idea that you're bringing the structural interpretation through it all the way down to the base. And there's something nice about that just gives it a little grounding to it. But I would agree with Deborah in the idea that I think that you can continue developing this further, and I think that you're heading in the right direction. And there's not really one right, one wrong. You're doing it well in both. I think that you can. I would say that continue to develop this further, and you're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. I think I don't have a strong preference one way or the other. If I were to choose one, if forced to, I would probably choose B, just because it does feel, again, sort of a little more substantial on the streetscape level, but I don't feel strongly that much.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
Technically, we need to have a motion to either not provide a recommendation or to recommend one of the options.
I recommend we do not provide I vote that we don't provide a recommendation. This is
Not allowed for development further. Yes, I second that.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so this is walking around to the McGrath side of the building where the loading dock and garage entries are.
So the differences between the bluer and the on B, the grayer ones, the grayer ones are metal or are they spandrel?
I think we're saying that basically everything to the right of the what I'll call the third column line on the left-hand side of the image would be spandrel glass, and that on option B, everything to the right of that third column line would be some sort of metal panel louver type system, something opaque to differentiate between what is essentially the back of house part of the facade and the public retail part of the facade.
And Victor, does B wrap around the corner to the west?
It doesn't wrap exactly, but it does pick up more on what the articulation is on the west. So yes, if A is really about sort of picking up the articulation on the east along Middlesex and pulling that around north, B is around doing the opposite, picking it up from the west side and pulling it around to the north. That is really the fundamental difference here.
Yeah, which I'm sort of intrigued by. So.
What is it that you're intrigued by, Deborah?
Is that I think it's okay that it's a fine facade, but it's back of house, and that it doesn't have the same quality as a retail space. So I like the distinction.
I agree with that. I like the distinction.
The amount of particulate coming off of that at that point too is it gets gross and dirty, and it would probably be easier to clean.
Option B, I motion.
All right.
I second.
All right,
Yeah.
Andrew? Option B. Unanimous. Okay. All right, and here we are to the rear of the building, the marginal road side, where we were just talking about the more service panelization.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of difference between these. Well, this is on this ground floor, with the exception of the very southern corner, where we might have a staff room, a security back of house room, something where people go a little bit in those last 2 days. The rest of it is really MEP space behind those. So the bulk of this is going to be, there's probably some louver in there, and it's a mix of louver and metal panel. The difference is that B, we've just added an extra level of a little bit of details, a little slot of spandrel glass, but it's spandrel glass. It's never going to be transparent or emit.
It's never going to be transparent. So it's never going to be transparent. So it doesn't matter whether you have an office behind there. It's going to be, you're not getting any of that.
Right. And this is all basically the switch gear and all of that happening down here. So.
Right. I mean, I like the idea. If we're going with the idea that we're trying to differentiate back of house spaces and like create glass and openness to the components are part of the urban realm in the streetscape, I think that I don't mind A as part of that just really showcases the idea that this is a base of a building that is not a front.
I strongly prefer A. Like I wouldn't want fake glass back there.
I agree.
I motion for A.
All right, Andrew.
Okay.
And I'll second that.
All right. And Frank, in favor?
Yes,
Okay.
in favor.
Option A. All right, terrific. All right, now I think we have to go through just go through each guideline and make sure it's been met to your satisfaction. And if you have any comments, and sort of as we go through these, please comment. So architectural bays.
Sarah, the first one is if any specific one is also important for this, like specifically more so than the others.
Thank you. Right, if there needs to have emphasis on something. So facades should be vertically articulated into a series of architectural bays no wider than 30 feet. Now, I did make a note from our first meeting that the structural bays are 24 feet wide.
Correct.
Yes.
So, met.
These don't have to be voted on totally. They could review them and then vote, number 1 through number 9. I realize they're bullet points, but.
Right.
Okay.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Correct. Right. Okay.
Okay, well, are there any comments, or let's look at these as groups then. Let's talk about the architectural base. Is there anything there that you would like to emphasize or comment on, to give advice?
I think that the only thing that I would, and I know that during these circumstances is even harder, but typically a lot of times when the designers come in front of us, they many times bring materials to try to showcase really what the intent of some of these facade materials are, and it helps us really understand some of that. And I would say perhaps moving forward, not that we need to review this again in my perspective, but to begin to see what the materials are, I would really like to understand the quality of materials, the wood, not wood. You know, is it a Nichiha? Is it a Swiss pearl type of product that would like? I would like to understand what those materials are moving forward. So it's more about materiality for me at this point. I think that they've hit on all the points that we've said, and I'm very good moving forward from a design perspective. But materials, there you go, would be really something that I would like to see next as they keep moving forward in front of the planning board.
Okay. So for you, the architectural bays are, there's nothing there that we need to emphasize or comment on, or, all right,
No.
then, do we need to actually vote on that, Dan?
No, we could take a vote on all of the ones that they feel have been met at the end. And having run through them, we should be able to identify any that need a recommendation or are important enough to identify as priority of importance. So I think
Okay.
going through all of them would be, yep. This next one is a residential tower one, so it's not really applicable.
Yeah, it's not relevant. Yeah, dwelling units, not relevant.
Let's go to the ground story. So we know we have the retail spaces, whether they'll be, sort of food and beverage, we don't know at this point, but there are definitely commercial activities at the pedestrian scale. It's a long way for these ground story commercial spaces to see the views of the waterfront.
I can't help with that one.
And,
Come on, Victor.
Victor, you can incorporate binoculars into
Yes,
that.
telescopes maybe.
Right? Okay, that'd be terrific.
I think we need a periscope.
Yeah, that will be better.
There are periscope on 2 of the assembly towers, so they're available.
They are.
Really?
That's right.
Really?
Yes.
Oh dear.
That's
I would
funny.
say that the ground story pieces are met.
Is there something here that you would like to draw attention to, or?
It's not
Yeah,
required.
I thought there's one thing, I don't know if this is the right place to talk about it. The one area I feel like I don't completely understand the intent of is a canopy over the the main, sort of inflecting towards the south.
Yep.
And I feel like that, I think some direction's been given to you, the Saki design team, in terms of like where the door is now, which might make you think about it differently. I'm wondering if there is some light coming through it, that somehow brings, more transparency to the glass,
Mm-hmm.
or like around the columns, or in some way, or somehow it has a stronger relationship with that whole slot above it. you know, I feel like that's the one area I feel like, and the other thought I had, if there's green on top of it, that I'm wondering if that green should feel captured and just be either larger scale, taller elements, or it's something about it. It just feels like it's ready to take that next step. That would be.
It needs that, as well as I think our next step is also looking at how it comes through the glass and into that lobby, right? The intent of that canopy is that it's another tool to help bridge the indoor-outdoor space, right? We as much as the ground plane should be doing that, the ceiling plane should be doing that, and be something that feels like it, again, has some more warmth, has some more life, has another sculptural character to it. But it's a critical part of the design of that space. So absolutely, we agree.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Great.
Okay. All right, so we've talked a little bit about materials. Actually, on the previous slide, oh, there it is, connection to, sorry, Dan. I have them in a different order. The connection to the adjacent open spaces, the connections.
If I could say one thing on this, and I think that, and as we spoke last time, I think that obviously the developer and the architects don't have a preview necessarily on this, but I would love to make sure that the connection through the highway at the bottom is aligned with what, you know, this development is, because I would hate to see this development happen and then that connector still being in discussion as it has been for the past 10 years, you know, and not really enhancing the connection, because I think that the park, the area in front, it needs it. And I think that if you don't have that activation of that connector, I think it would be a failed urban, you know, space. So I just would like to say that I know that it's the city's in control and that there's a separate team working on it, but I would love to see those two things working together and being developed at the same time, so that they enhance each other and complement each other, and that you don't have like this dark alley and then this beautiful like space at the other street that nobody wants to cross over.
So Frank, just to one thing, Courtney Kirk, who couldn't be here today, is the project manager for both this project in public space and urban forestry and for the Kensington Connector project. So she is kind of that natural, and she's a registered landscape architect and will be working on it.
Okay. Yeah. But we all agree, right? I think it's a success for both of these pieces
Absolutely.
to have them come into fruition together, because I think that that's just going to enhance all of this, and you know, we've been looking forward to it for a while. I've seen it in so many presentations.
Yeah, I've been holding back on that one, and I'm trying not to say anything, but I agree with everything Frank says. I'd say one thing that would help too is, I think, just on the diagrams as they're presented right now, there is that sort of sad strip in front of the public storage area that is public plaza space that right now I think you guys are just representing as other, but I think thinking about that and acknowledging what that is, and that your design butts right up on it, and that it is part of the primary circulation, would be incredibly helpful when we move to the open space discussion.
Yeah. And the intent, just to give you guys a little bit about a background. So the master plan special permit was approved by the planning board last week. And so the intent is that as they've talked about, as was presented, the right of way becomes sort of the entry plaza for the building. It's actually a through block plaza as designated on the master plan. And then the open space, which is the current Kensington Park. The idea is that the through block plaza becomes part of that space. So all spaces basically are designed together with the connector as well. And then that space will become a neighborhood park for the area. So it will incorporate and look pretty seamless, is the intent in the
Right.
long run. So,
That's great. Okay.
all right, so I have the note about, would like to understand final materiality.
I guess I would add also materiality for the landscape as well. Like what, if we are tying into the assembly standard, or if we are creating something new that becomes a Middlesex standard, knowing that one way or the other.
Okay. All right.
Sarah, I didn't hear any objections to these design guidelines, so there could be a question of a vote for finding all of the design guidelines to have been met, sans the tower one.
I vote for that. All of the guidelines to have been met, aside from the towers, which is not applicable.
All right. Do I have a
I
second?
Yep, second.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. All in favor?
Yay. Frank says yes.
The last question is whether or not any of the design guidelines are a priority, as in the opinion of the voting membership, which it's not required to find any of them like that, but if there are any, you would call them out.
No, not for me.
Okay. Not even the materials that you were
Well-
discussing them, Frank, or?
Well, the materials, yes, they're important. I mean, is that what we're saying, that we're calling that out as a? Sure.
I would go for connection to the opening spaces as being very important, considering the connection to the Kensington, considering that this has such a potential for benefit to East Somerville and to Assembly.
Sure. And to that, I would say also the materials to the building would be very important for us to understand moving forward. I think that we would like to approve something that we understand the materials with, so that we approve a design intent with the materials.
Okay. I mean, okay, so do I have a motion that says the priority guidelines are the connections to abutting open spaces and the general materiality of the building?
Yes.
Well, actually, can I clarify that? Let's call it the type and color of materials used for a building.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Second that.
And I agree.
All right.
Yay.
Okay.
Our first Zoom approval. Victor, thank you very much for your quick turnaround, by the way.
Thank you all.
Just good.
This is really coming along. I think this is a very handsome project.
Yeah, it'll be an exciting one. We're enthusiastic, so thank you for all the time.
I was really surprised at the scale of the highway next to the building.
I know, right?
I said, that's a big building. And even Assembly Square, that
Yeah.
section was helpful for me.
Totally.
Okay, so I think the last motion we need is to adjourn. Is that true, Dan?
That is true. I'd like to explain one thing for the development team. We will now craft the formal recommendation of the board for their approval. So we will write it up and send it to them to review the language. And then they have to formally transmit that via us to the planning board within 45 days of tonight's meeting. We don't anticipate it will take 45 days, but that is the timing in the zoning.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, yes, motion to adjourn would be the last action.
Motion
I
to
motion
adjourn.
to adjourn.
I do have one.
Who has a question?
I think
I
Deb
think-
beat you just barely, Frank.
This is the actual Ryan Seller.
Victor. Is that Victor who wanted to say something? Who?
It was Ryan Seller.
Oh, the Ryan.
The real Ryan.
The real Ryan.
Well,
What's up, Ryan?
yeah, thanks. Hey, so just maybe this is for after adjournment. You, Sarah, please clarify. But then this is one site plan, and then we still have another one to address the civic space. Do we want to
That's right.
address that now, steps, or is that something we do after this meeting?
Not on the
As
agenda.
in, not on the agenda. So discussion is anything related to it is next meeting or offline.
That is correct.
Correct.
Thank you.
All right. So I have a unanimous vote to adjourn the meeting at 8:20 p.m.
You adjourn.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night, guys.
You too.
Good night.
Goodbye.